On the day of her daughter's graduation, Rachel's world crumbled in front of hundreds of guests. Her husband, standing beside her, announced that he was leaving her. In that moment, everything went silent. But Rachel didn't cry. Instead, she handed him one envelope. That envelope contained the truth that would shatter him far more than his departure ever could. Rachel Anderson had spent the past 18 years shaping a life that looked perfect from the outside. A loving husband, a beautiful home, and a daughter who was about to walk across the stage to receive her diploma. She had been the pillar, the one who held everything together. But the foundation she had built on love and sacrifice was about to crack. She didn't know it yet, but this was the day that would change everything. Rachel had always been the quiet one, the one who kept her head down, worked hard, and took care of everyone around her. And when her daughter, Emily, had asked her to attend graduation with a smile, Rachel had agreed, just as she always did. But Emily's big day wouldn't be the one Rachel had envisioned. It would be the day her marriage crumbled. And it would be the day Rachel found the strength to break the silence with a single envelope, an envelope that would change their lives forever. The auditorium was filled with the hum of excitement, the scent of fresh flowers in the air, and the proud smiles of parents watching their children walk toward their futures. Rachel sat in the front row, her eyes focused on her daughter, Emily, who was standing on stage with her peers, awaiting her name to be called. It had been a long journey, one Rachel had been there for every step of the way. From the late-night study sessions to the tearful high school breakups, she had been Emily's unwavering support. She had worked tirelessly to ensure that Emily had every opportunity to succeed, even if it meant sacrificing her own dreams along the way. But as Rachel watched her daughter, a sense of unease began to creep over her. Something was off. The pride in her heart felt heavy, and it wasn't just the weight of watching her only child step into adulthood. It was the feeling that something was about to change, something Rachel couldn't control, something she had been avoiding for far too long. Her husband, David, was sitting beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. He hadn't spoken much throughout the ceremony, which was unusual. Normally, he would have been making small talk with the other parents, pointing out friends, and engaging in light banter. But today, his quiet demeanor didn't sit right with Rachel. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, noting how distant he seemed. And then, as the last name was called, Emily stepped forward, accepting her diploma with a smile. The crowd erupted in applause. Rachel's heart swelled with pride. Her daughter was ready to take on the world. But before Rachel could fully bask in the moment, David stood up. He didn't announce it with words. It wasn't an excited proclamation like you'd expect from a proud parent. No, it was something quieter, something colder. Rachel's gaze snapped to him as he moved toward the microphone, a small piece of paper in his hand. The moment felt suspended in time, like a breath held too long. David cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice louder than Rachel had anticipated. His tone was flat, detached. "Before we continue the celebration, I have something important I need to say." Rachel's stomach twisted in knots. The crowd, still buzzing with excitement, began to quiet down. She could feel the weight of their collective attention shift from Emily to David. It wasn't the moment Rachel had imagined, and for the first time in years, she felt a sharp sting of anxiety deep within her. David took another step forward, eyes meeting Rachel's only briefly before he addressed the crowd again. "Rachel," he said, his voice cold, "I don't want to drag this out, but the truth is, I've been unhappy for some time now, and I've made the decision that it's time for us to part ways." The words hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. Her pulse spiked, and the noise around her grew muffled, as if the world had suddenly gone silent, leaving only David's words hanging in the air. "I've been seeing someone else," he continued, his eyes scanning the room, "and I think it's best if we move on. I know this isn't ideal, but I wanted to be upfront with everyone here." "Rachel, I'm sorry." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Rachel's heart raced, but her body remained still, almost as if frozen in place. She felt a coldness wash over her, and for a long moment, she couldn't even bring herself to speak. David's gaze finally settled on Emily, who stood in the front row, her face pale, her expression unreadable. Rachel wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding before her. Emily's voice cracked as she whispered, "Dad." David turned toward her, and for the first time, Rachel saw something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, of regret. But it was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "I know this is difficult, Emily," David said softly, "but this is what's best." Rachel's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was shaking. She had been blindsided. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was an announcement made in front of hundreds of people on her daughter's most important day. But Rachel wasn't the kind of woman to crumble in front of an audience. She had learned long ago how to swallow her pain, how to smile when her heart was breaking. And she would not let this man, the man who had promised her forever, destroy her daughter's day. David stepped away from the microphone and began to walk toward the exit, without another word. Rachel felt a wave of nausea. Her mind raced, but there was no time to process the reality of his words. He was already walking out the door, leaving her with a broken heart and the entire auditorium staring in disbelief. Rachel didn't move at first. She couldn't. The weight of what had just happened crushed her, and her vision blurred. But then, through the haze, she saw Emily. Her daughter was standing there, paralyzed, trying to understand what had just happened. Rachel stood up and walked toward her, slowly, deliberately, as if every step took an immense effort. She reached Emily, her hand trembling as she placed it on her shoulder. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "What just happened?" Rachel looked at her daughter who had been robbed of her happiness, who had been forced to witness the unraveling of everything she thought was secure. And in that moment, something inside Rachel shifted. The weight she had carried for so long, the pain of her marriage, the years of silence, flooded her. But so did a quiet strength. She could not protect Emily from the heartbreak, but she could show her the strength to rise above it. "I know this is painful, sweetheart," Rachel said softly, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. "But this doesn't define you. It doesn't define us." Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, one that had been sealed for months, hidden in the back of a drawer. She handed it to Emily, without saying a word. Emily took the envelope, her hands shaking as she opened it. Inside was a letter, and with it, documents that Rachel had kept hidden. The divorce papers, the will, and the secret bank accounts Rachel had set aside for herself, independent of David. "I'm not going to let this be the end," Rachel said quietly. "You deserve more than this, Emily. You deserve the truth. And you deserve to know that I am not leaving. I'm just starting over." As the last of the guests filtered out of the auditorium, Rachel and Emily stood alone, the weight of the moment settling in. David had walked out on his family, but Rachel wasn't walking away. She was just walking forward. And in that moment, Rachel knew she had the strength to rebuild everything. To rebuild for herself. And to rebuild for Emily. They had both been left out of the life they had built. But they wouldn't be left behind. The day after David's announcement, the house felt like a cavern. The air had thickened with questions that weren't mine to answer, and grief that was too much for one person to carry. I had barely slept, barely eaten, but there was one thing I knew for certain. I couldn't let the story end this way. Not for Emily, not for me. I spent that entire night going over everything. The life we had built together, the house we had made a home, the future we had planned, everything. And then, through the fog of shock and pain, something clicked. I had never truly built a future for myself. I had always built it around him, around what he needed, what he wanted, what we could do together. I had sacrificed parts of myself, my career, my independence, my voice, because I thought we were the center of it all. But David had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated me. And worse, he had underestimated the strength of the woman I had forgotten I was. Emily didn't say much in the days that followed. She stayed in her room mostly, avoiding eye contact and retreating into silence. I didn't blame her. The betrayal wasn't just mine. It was hers too. The man she had trusted, the father who had promised her forever, had turned away without so much as a second thought. But I knew something had to change. She needed to see the truth, see that life could move forward, that there was more to her than the love she had once given away too freely. I didn't let her hide forever. I made sure she knew that I wasn't going anywhere, that the love between us hadn't been severed by David's actions. I just kept showing up. And then came the night when she finally broke the silence. We were sitting together in the kitchen, the only room in the house that still felt like it had a pulse. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Emily had been watching me for the past few hours as I prepared dinner, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and cautious. "Mom, how are you doing this?" I paused, wiping my hands on a dish towel. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. The truth was already rising inside me. "How are you doing it, Mom?" she repeated. "You just keep going. Like it doesn't hurt." I turned and met her eyes, feeling the heaviness of her question sink into my chest. "Because I have to, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady, even though the truth burned. I could lay down and let it consume me, but then I wouldn't be the woman you need. I wouldn't be the woman I know I am. She looked down, shaking her head. "I don't get it. How do you just keep going after he left us? He left you." I walked over and sat beside her, taking her hand in mine. Her palm was cold, trembling. "Because leaving doesn't mean I'm lost, Emily," I whispered. "He walked away from us. But that doesn't mean we stop moving forward. It's not about him. It never was." She nodded, but I could see the hurt still in her eyes, still so fresh. "But the envelope? The one you gave me after everything?" I took a deep breath. This was the moment where everything would change, where the truth would be revealed, and Emily would finally know just how far I had gone to make sure we would survive. "David didn't take everything," I said quietly. "I made sure of that." She furrowed her brow, confusion clouding her face. "What do you mean?" How did you stop him?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope I had kept hidden, tucked away since that day at the graduation ceremony. It was the same envelope that David had ignored, the one he had thought would be his victory. But instead, it was my shield. "After everything," I said, handing her the envelope, "I decided to take control of what was mine, what I built, the trust one had in myself. This is my future, not his." Emily took the envelope carefully, her fingers trembling as she opened it. She pulled out the divorce papers, the bank statements, the documentation of everything David had tried to erase. Her eyes widened as she scanned the papers. "I never told him about this," I continued. "I had kept it hidden, not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't trust myself to remember that I had the right to build my life on my own terms. So I set up a trust fund in my name. I secured my finances. I protected us." She looked up at me, her expression shifting from shock to awe. "I wanted to make sure that no matter what happened between us, no matter how he decided to betray us, that I would still be able to give you the life you deserve. He's not going to control us anymore. He never should have." The next day, I contacted an attorney. I didn't care what David had planned or what stories he was telling about his new life. I wasn't going to spend one more moment allowing him to manipulate the narrative. The divorce papers were filed, but it wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about taking back what was mine, what was ours. And this time, there was no room for his excuses. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. But there was something different now. There was no fear, no second-guessing, no wondering whether I'd done the right thing. Because deep down, I knew I had. I had given everything I had to that marriage, to Emily, to our life. But now it was time to give to myself. And I wouldn't apologize for that. One evening, just before the hearing for the finalization of the divorce, Emily came to me. She had a quiet smile on her face, but her eyes told another story. She had changed. She had grown. She had become the woman she was always meant to be. "Mom, I don't know how you did it," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But I know I'm not the only one who's been hurting. And I just wanted to say thank you." I squeezed her hand. "You don't have to thank me. You're stronger than you think." She leaned in, and kissed my cheek. We're both stronger than we think. The divorce was finalized without any complications, and David's presence in our lives slowly faded into a distant memory. And in the end, it wasn't just about the money. It was about taking back my life. It was about standing on my own 2 feet, remembering who I was, and showing Emily the strength she didn't even know she had. We didn't need David's approval. We didn't need his permission. All we needed was each other. The first time I looked at the house and didn't feel the weight of his absence, I knew I was truly healing. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting on the porch, watching the sun start to set, casting a soft golden glow over the yard. The garden we had once worked on together, planting roses and tulips, was now just mine. The flowers bloomed with a new kind of vitality, as if they, too, had found their own strength in the years that had passed. For the first time, I felt like I belonged in this house, not because it was his or ours, but because it was mine. David had been gone for months by then. The house was still quiet, but it was a peaceful kind of silence. The kind that settled into your bones and felt like home. Emily came by often, still working through her own healing, but no longer with the same guilt or hesitation. She was building her life, too. And in the process, we were finding each other again. We didn't need grand gestures anymore. We didn't need promises. Just presence. Just the knowledge that no matter what, we had each other's backs. I continued my work at the gallery, and something inside me started to shift. I wasn't just curating shows anymore. I was creating them. I wasn't just doing it for the paycheck or the validation. I was doing it because it made me feel alive again. The space was mine to shape. The artists were mine to support. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was in the shadows of someone else's success. The small successes built on each other, like bricks in a wall, and I began to realize that this was the life I had been waiting for all along. One evening, I found myself at an art opening that I had helped curate. The room was filled with people, artists, patrons, all of them admiring the works on the walls. But I wasn't looking at the paintings. I wasn't focused on the crowd. I was watching the woman who had stepped up, who had found herself again, despite everything that had tried to knock her down. That woman was standing tall in front of the crowd. That woman was me. A few people came up to congratulate me, and I smiled, thanking them politely. But what really struck me was the realization that the success of the night had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. I didn't need validation. I had already built my foundation. I had already found my strength. As the night wore on, Emily texted me, "How's the event going?" I smiled and quickly replied, "It's perfect. Just like you." The message made me think. It had been a while since we had had one of those quiet moments together. But this was her night, too. It wasn't just about me anymore. We had both survived the storm and now had the chance to rebuild, not just for ourselves, but for each other. The following week, we met for coffee. It had become a bit of a tradition. Quiet mornings where we talked about anything and everything, but never the past. There was no need to dredge it up anymore. We were walking forward. "Mom," she said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that we can't keep waiting for people to define us, that we're the only ones who get to choose our worth." I nodded, looking at her with pride. "You know I meant it, sweetheart." She smiled, and I saw something new in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. She had her life ahead of her, and this time, she wasn't just stepping into it with uncertainty. She was stepping into it with the strength I had always known she had. "I think I finally get it," she said quietly. "You've been strong for so long, and I never understood how until now. But I'm ready to be strong, too." It wasn't the words I had always wanted to hear, but it was the right words. And for the first time, I knew she wasn't just my daughter. She was a woman, standing beside me, not beneath me. That evening, I sat in my favorite chair, the one by the window. It was my space, my quiet moment. I took a deep breath, remembering everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. The future wasn't some distant promise anymore. It was here. It was mine. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to ask for permission to live it. It's funny how life works. When you've been through enough, when you've been dragged to your knees, when everything you thought was solid turns to dust, you start to see things differently. You stop asking questions like, why me? And start asking, why not me? Because at the end of it all, the pain becomes a part of you. A part that you can either let break you or let shape you. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just existing, I was living. It was 6 months after the divorce was finalized when I got the call. The one I had been expecting, but never quite ready for. David. He hadn't reached out since he left, not in any significant way. He'd made no effort to fix what he had broken, and I wasn't in any rush to let him. But as I sat in my quiet living room, my phone buzzing on the table, I felt a strange mix of nerves and curiosity. I knew, even before I answered, that this was a conversation I didn't need to have. But I answered it anyway. Rachel. His voice came through, rougher than it used to be, strained as if he had been drinking or just avoiding his feelings for too long. David, I said calmly, leaning back into the chair. It's been a while. I've been meaning to call, he said, his voice faltering slightly. He paused. I don't know how to say this, but I've been thinking. About the way I left, about the way I acted. I leaned forward, my heart starting to beat faster. You left. You acted. And then you disappeared. I've had a lot of time to think about it, too. The silence on the other end felt heavy. I didn't push him. I had learned long ago that words came when they were ready, not when I needed them. But this time, I wasn't waiting for an apology. I know what I did wasn't right, he continued. But I'm begging you to listen. I want to fix this. I want to make things right with you, and with Emily. I held my breath. His words had the same pull they always had, like he was trying to convince me that we could be something again. But there was no we left. There hadn't been for a long time. You're late, David, I said softly. Emily and I are building our own life now. We don't need your apology to move forward. He didn't reply right away. I could hear him breathing, trying to think of something else to say. But the silence that hung between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was freeing. I don't want your forgiveness, I added. But I do want you to know that I'm okay. Emily's okay. And we've moved on. I hung up before he could say another word. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. There was a part of me that wanted to break down and scream, wanted to demand answers for everything he had done. But that part was fading. Instead, I found myself walking through the days with a quiet strength, one I hadn't known I possessed before. I spent time at the gallery. I spent time with Emily. I spent time with myself. And slowly, I realized I didn't need the answers anymore. I had been looking for so long, waiting for someone to explain the pieces of my life I couldn't piece together. But the truth wasn't something David could give me. The truth was mine. Weeks passed, and the change in me was undeniable. Emily started to settle into her own life, too. She had always been strong, but now she was starting to believe it. We talked often about her future, about her dreams, and where she wanted to go. She was no longer caught in the web of uncertainty that had once kept her tied to David's choices. She was free. We were both free. We planned a trip together to Italy, something I had always dreamed of doing but never could, given the constraints of my old life. This time, there would be no restrictions. No shame. No guilt. Just two women, mother and daughter, traveling for the first time in years without the baggage of our past weighing us down. One evening, as we walked through a cobbled street in Florence, under the glow of the street lamps, I turned to Emily and said, I think I've finally found peace. She looked at me, her eyes wide, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You've always had it, Mom. You just had to realize it. I smiled back. And that was the moment I knew. I hadn't just rebuilt my life. I had reclaimed it. Every piece, every fragment, every scar that had once been a source of pain had turned into a reminder of my strength. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. As I stood on the balcony of our hotel, looking out over the city lights, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude wash over me. Not because everything had been perfect, but because everything had been real. David's betrayal, the hurt, the heartache. They had led me here, to this place, to this moment, where I finally understood that no one could take away what was rightfully mine. My worth, my strength, my power. I thought of my father, who had always told me to never settle for anything less than what I deserved. He had been right. And now, as I watched the city below me pulse with life, I knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The next chapter of my life wasn't about what I had lost. It was about what I had built. I had always told myself that success was something shared, that a relationship, a family, a home needed to be nurtured with the same level of care and attention you would give to a garden. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that a garden needs a gardener who knows how to prune as much as it needs someone to plant the seeds. David never understood that. He never saw me for who I was or what I had given. He took, and when the well ran dry, he walked away. But that was his mistake. The truth was, I didn't need him to complete me. I had always been whole, even when I was walking through the darkest parts of my life. It was a Sunday afternoon when I finally made the decision to put down roots. Again, this time for myself. Emily and I had spent a few months bouncing between small towns, rediscovering what it meant to be a family on our terms. But this time, I wasn't leaving. This time I was home. I found an old house in the city. Not too big, not too small, with an ivy-covered wall and a yard that had been untended for years. But I saw potential. I could feel it in my bones. This would be the home where we would plant the next seeds of our lives. Where we would grow, where Emily would grow into a woman who would one day realize that her worth was never tied to someone else's opinion. And that's exactly what I did. The process wasn't easy. The house was a project. So many repairs to be done, so many layers of dust and decay to remove. But I worked at it bit by bit. Emily helped, of course, although she was often busy with work. And as the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, the house began to take shape. Not just physically, but emotionally. I remember standing in the kitchen one morning, looking out at the newly planted roses in the garden, when it hit me. I wasn't just rebuilding a house, I was rebuilding me. This was where I would continue my story. This was where the pain of the past would finally be put to rest, not forgotten, but integrated into the person I had become. The day I finally hosted my first dinner party in the new house, it felt like the culmination of everything I had worked for. Emily was there, of course, as were a few close friends from the gallery and some of the women I had met through my work at the community center. We sat around the table, talking and laughing, the smell of home-cooked food filling the air. The conversation was easy, the kind of flowing dialogue that comes from real connection. There was no tension, no awkward silences. It was a celebration of what I had accomplished, not just physically, but emotionally. And in the midst of it all, I found myself thinking back to the years when I had been too afraid to ask for more. When I had been too scared to stand up for myself, to claim the space that was rightfully mine. But I had found that space now. I had built it from the ground up. A few weeks later, Emily came to me with some exciting news. "Mom," she said, sitting down across from me at the kitchen table. "I got a promotion at work. They're offering me the position of lead project manager for a big international campaign. It's everything I've worked for." I smiled at her, feeling a mix of pride and awe. "I'm so proud of you, Emily. You've earned it." She paused, her hands fiddling with her coffee cup, before she added, "But there's more. I've been thinking about something." "What is it, sweetheart?" "I want to do something for myself, Mom. Something I've always wanted, but never had the courage to do. I want to go to Italy for 6 months and study art. I want to find out what's out there for me, beyond everything else." I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, but it wasn't sadness. It was pride. I saw myself in her, in the way she was ready to break free, to create her own path. "You don't have to ask for permission, you know," I said softly. "If this is what you need to do for you, then go. You deserve this. You've always deserved it." She smiled, a tear escaping her eye. "I'm ready, Mom." As Emily prepared for her trip, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. From the broken woman who had watched her husband walk away at her daughter's graduation, to the woman who now stood on her own, watching her daughter take her own steps into the world. I had learned that family doesn't always come in the form of a traditional structure. Sometimes, it's found in the people you choose to surround yourself with. In the ones who see you, not as a mother, not as a wife, but as a person with your own dreams, your own future. And now, as I stood in my garden, watching the flowers bloom again, I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. In the months that followed, my life took on a rhythm I hadn't known in years. My work at the gallery continued to flourish. I started teaching art classes at a local community center, helping others find their own voices through paint and sculpture. I even began working on my own pieces again, not for sale, not for approval, but for the joy of creation. The emptiness I had once felt had been replaced with something I had only just begun to understand: freedom. The freedom to be myself, to choose my path, to follow the dreams that had always been inside me. One afternoon, I received a call from Emily. "Mom, I've been thinking. I don't think I'm ready to come back yet. I've found my place here. But I wanted you to know you've inspired me. I'm going to start my own business. A small art gallery for young artists." I felt my heart swell. "I'm so proud of you, Emily. You have the strength to do anything you put your mind to, and I'll always be here for you." She paused for a moment before adding, "Mom, I think we both finally figured it out, didn't we?" "We did," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "We really did." And so, as the seasons continued to change, so did we. The house was no longer just bricks and mortar. It was home. Emily was no longer just my daughter. She was my equal. And I was no longer just a woman who had been abandoned. I was a woman who had rebuilt everything I had lost, piece by piece. I didn't need permission to live anymore. I had built this life. For me. And for the woman I had always known I could be. It's strange, how sometimes you can live your whole life in the shadow of someone else's expectations, only to realize that the moment you step into your own light, the world shifts completely. But then again, what do they say about light? That it's always there, even when you can't see it. Sometimes, it just takes the right moment to find it. The day Emily left for Italy was one of the most bittersweet moments of my life. The house felt quieter, emptier, and yet, there was peace in that silence. She was doing something I never had the courage to do at her age, taking ownership of her life, chasing a dream she'd buried for years. And she was doing it on her terms, not anyone else's. I watched her pack the last of her things into her suitcase, her eyes glistening with excitement. "I'm going to send you postcards from every city I visit, Mom," she said, giving me a hug that lingered just a little longer than usual. "You'd better," I teased. "I'll expect nothing less." As I watched her walk out the door, I felt a deep sense of pride, not just for her, but for the woman I had become. We had both found our way in different ways, but we had both come back to ourselves. That evening, after Emily's plane had taken off, I sat in the living room, the soft hum of the city outside filling the space. I had been through the motions of life, of marriage, of motherhood, of losing myself and finding myself again, but it was in this moment of solitude that I realized I had truly arrived. I wasn't just a woman who had survived. I was a woman who had thrived. I had rebuilt my life with my own hands, and no one could take that away from me. I took out a piece of paper and began to write, as I often did when I needed to express what was in my heart. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. It was mine to create. A few months passed, and life settled into its new rhythm. I kept working at the gallery, teaching my art classes, and growing the small but thriving network I had built for myself. I had come to realize that it wasn't just about professional success. It was about the ability to move through life without looking back, without regret. I received a letter one afternoon. It was from David. I had no expectation that he would reach out. After everything that had happened, I thought I was finally done with him. But the letter was brief, apologetic in its tone. It wasn't an apology I needed or even wanted, but it was one he clearly needed to make. The letter read, "Rachel, I don't expect forgiveness. I've come to understand that the mistakes I made cannot be undone, but I've been working on myself. I don't want to disrupt your life or your peace, but I needed to tell you I'm sorry for the hurt I caused, for the silence I created. I hope one day you can see that I never meant to destroy what we had. I lost myself. And I can only hope you've found everything you deserve. David. I sat with that letter for a long time. I read it over and over, trying to make sense of the emotions it stirred. There was no anger left in me. There was no desire to revisit the past or to demand something from him. There was just a quiet, solemn acceptance. I took a deep breath and placed the letter in the drawer where I had kept all the pieces of my life that no longer had a place. I didn't need to hold on to it. It was part of my past and I had already moved on. But in that moment, I realized that what I had once thought was the end of my story, my marriage, my loss, my betrayal, had been just the beginning of something even more profound. I had learned to live for me. Later that week, I received a call from Emily. She had settled into Florence, taking art classes and beginning to explore her own future. There was a calmness in her voice that I hadn't heard before. She was finding herself, just as I had. "Mom," she said, "I'm thinking about staying here a little longer. I've found a gallery that wants to showcase my work. And I just feel like this is the right place, the right time." I smiled to myself. I had known from the beginning that Italy was where she needed to be. Not just because it was a dream of hers, but because it was a place where she could breathe, where she could finally shed the weight of everything that had once held her back. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," I said softly. "This is your journey, and it's only just beginning." A few months later, I flew to Florence to visit Emily. We walked the cobbled streets together, hand in hand, like we had when she was younger. I saw in her eyes the same determination, the same fire I had once carried within me. But this time, she wasn't just mimicking me. She was becoming her own woman, a woman I could be proud of, someone who would never shrink, never apologize for taking up space. We visited galleries, museums, and coffee shops where the artists spoke passionately about their work. Emily fit right in, not as a daughter following in her mother's footsteps, but as an artist in her own right, carving out her space in a world that had once seemed too big for her. It was on that trip that Emily told me something that made my heart swell. "Mom, I think I want to open my own gallery. I've been thinking about it a lot. I want to create a space for young artists like the one we've always talked about." My heart skipped a beat. I had known this day would come, but hearing her say it out loud felt like the final piece of the puzzle. "You will, Emily. I have no doubt," I said, the pride swelling in my chest. "But don't do it for anyone else. Do it for you, because you can." When I returned home, the house felt even more like mine. I had finally settled into the woman I had always been but had forgotten along the way. I was more than a mother, more than a wife. I was Rachel Anderson, the woman who had been knocked down and rebuilt herself from the ground up. And I realized something. The legacy I wanted to leave wasn't about wealth or property. It wasn't about material success. It was about living my truth, about empowering those around me to live theirs. I had given my daughter the tools to live her own life. I had shown her the importance of standing tall, even when the world seemed to knock you down. One evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the moonlight spilling across the room. The house was quiet, just the hum of the city outside and the soft ticking of the clock. I took a deep breath and smiled, realizing that, after all the years of fear, doubt, and pain, I had found my place. And no one, not David, not anyone, could take that away. I was exactly where I was meant to be. And nothing at all was going to stop me from living fully, freely, and unapologetically.